After my husband's funeral, my sister said his child deserved my house. I smiled and said, "Show me the proof." The night I disappeared, nobody noticed at first, and maybe that was the worst part of it. The city kept breathing, traffic lights kept blinking red to green to yellow, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular while I stood on the edge of the old overpass gripping the cold metal railing like it was the only thing keeping me attached to the planet. I wasn't planning to jump. I wasn't planning anything, really. I just needed to feel the wind against my face and pretend that the rushing cars beneath me were carrying everyone else somewhere meaningful while I remained suspended in a life that felt like it had quietly unraveled without asking my permission. A year earlier, I had a job I didn't hate, a girlfriend who said she loved me, and a father who still called every Sunday. Now the job was gone, outsourced to a company that sent a polite email thanking me for my dedication. The girlfriend had packed her things in cardboard boxes labeled miscellaneous, and my father's number had become something I stared at but couldn't bring myself to dial because I didn't know how to explain that I had failed in ways that didn't show up on a resume. The overpass felt safer than my apartment because at least here the noise outside matched the noise in my head. I remember thinking that if I leaned far enough forward, I could almost believe the wind was pushing me instead of pulling me back. I stayed there longer than I meant to, until the air grew colder and my hands went numb, and I finally stepped away not because I felt better, but because I felt tired. That's how it started, not with a dramatic breakdown or a screaming match, but with a quiet exhaustion that settled into my bones and refused to leave. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight cutting across my living room floor like a spotlight searching for someone worth illuminating, and I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, wondering when I had stopped recognizing the person whose life I was living. I used to think rock bottom would feel like a crash, something loud and obvious, but it was more like sinking into wet sand, slow and subtle until you realized you couldn't move without making it worse. I stopped answering texts. I stopped checking emails. I let dishes stack in the sink until they formed a fragile tower that looked like it might collapse if I breathed too hard. Every day blurred into the next. A loop of scrolling through job listings I didn't believe I was qualified for and rehearsing imaginary conversations where I explained my gap in employment like it was a brave personal choice instead of a humiliation I carried in my chest. The only person who seemed to notice something was off was Mrs. Alvarez from across the hall, who knocked one afternoon with a container of homemade soup and a look that said she'd seen this kind of silence before. She didn't ask questions, just handed me the soup and told me to bring the container back when I was done. I almost told her I wasn't hungry, but I took it anyway, and that small exchange felt heavier than it should have. It's strange how kindness can feel like a spotlight when you've been hiding in the dark. I ate the soup standing in the kitchen, and for a moment I felt something close to gratitude, which surprised me because I had convinced myself I didn't deserve anything good. That belief had been growing quietly for months, fed by every rejection email and every unanswered call. It whispered that I was replaceable, forgettable, the kind of person who fades into the background of other people's lives. And maybe I would have kept listening to that voice if it weren't for the phone call that came 3 days later. It was my sister, which was unusual because we mostly communicated through short texts and holiday visits that felt polite but distant. She didn't waste time with small talk. She told me Dad had fallen in the driveway and hit his head. He was conscious, but he was in the hospital for observation. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember locking the door. I just remember driving too fast and gripping the steering wheel like I was trying to outrun the guilt that had been building for months. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, and when I walked into his room, he looked smaller than I remembered, like someone had quietly reduced him while I wasn't paying attention. He smiled when he saw me, and that smile nearly broke me. He made a joke about getting old, about gravity being stronger than it used to be, and I laughed even though my throat felt tight. My sister stood by the window with her arms crossed, giving me a look that was half accusation, half relief. We hadn't said it out loud, but we both knew I had been absent, not just physically but emotionally. I sat by Dad's bed and listened to the steady beep of the monitor, and for the first time in months, my problems felt smaller than something else. Not insignificant, but not the center of the universe either. When he reached for my hand, his grip was weaker than I expected, but it was still steady. He told me he was proud of me, and I almost asked him for what, but I didn't. I just nodded and swallowed the shame that threatened to spill out. After he was discharged, I stayed at his house for a few days to help out, fixing loose steps on the porch and cooking simple meals that we ate at the kitchen table where I had done my homework as a kid. It was in that quiet house, surrounded by the creaks and familiar smells of my childhood, that something shifted. Not a dramatic epiphany, not a sudden burst of motivation, just a small crack in the wall I had built around myself. One evening, while Dad napped in his recliner, I found an old box of photographs in the closet. There were pictures of me as a kid holding up science fair ribbons, grinning like I had just discovered fire. There were photos of me in a cheap cap and gown at graduation, eyes wide with the kind of hope that doesn't know how hard the world can be. I stared at those images and felt a strange mix of nostalgia and grief, like I was mourning a version of myself I had lost somewhere along the way. I kept thinking, when did I stop believing in that guy? When did I decide he wasn't worth fighting for? The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and stepped outside to sit on the porch. The air was crisp, and the neighborhood was quiet except for a few birds arguing in a nearby tree. I watched the sun climb slowly over the rooftops, and I realized I had been living as if my worst moment defined my entire story. Losing a job had become proof that I was incapable. A breakup had become evidence that I was unlovable. Silence from friends had turned into confirmation that I didn't matter. I had taken isolated events and built an identity out of them. And sitting there on that porch, I understood how unfair that was, not just to the world but to myself. Recovery didn't happen overnight. It didn't come with a montage or a dramatic speech. It came in small, unremarkable choices. I updated my resume even though it made me anxious. I applied for jobs even when I expected rejection. I started going for short runs in the evening, not because I suddenly cared about fitness, but because I needed to feel my lungs burn and remind myself I was alive. I called my sister and asked her about her work, really listened this time. I returned Mrs. Alvarez's container and thanked her properly. These were tiny actions, almost invisible from the outside, but they felt like stitches holding something fragile together. There were setbacks, of course. Interviews that ended with polite smiles and no follow-up. Days when the old voice returned, telling me it was pointless to try. Nights when I lay awake replaying every mistake I had ever made. But the difference was that I no longer believed that voice automatically. I started questioning it, asking for evidence, challenging its certainty. Sometimes I even won the argument. The first job offer I received wasn't glamorous. It paid less than my previous position and required a longer commute. But when the hiring manager called to say they were impressed with my persistence and problem-solving approach, I felt something ignite in my chest. It wasn't just relief. It was validation that I was still capable of contributing, of being seen. On my first day, I arrived early and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, heart pounding, reminding myself that fear didn't mean I was unqualified. It meant I cared. The work was challenging in ways that forced me to stretch, to learn new systems and adapt quickly. There were moments I felt overwhelmed, but instead of retreating, I asked questions. I stayed late to understand processes. I let myself be a beginner again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, confidence returned, not as arrogance, but as quiet confidence. Outside of work, I kept building small routines. I cleaned my apartment until it felt like a place someone hopeful might live. I reconnected with an old friend for coffee and admitted I had been struggling. To my surprise, he admitted he had too. We talked for hours about expectations and disappointment and the pressure to appear successful even when you feel like you're drowning. That conversation reminded me that isolation is often self-imposed, built from assumptions about how others will judge us. The more honest I became, the less alone I felt. Months passed and Dad recovered well enough to resume his stubborn independence, though he now used a cane he pretended not to need. One evening, he invited me over for dinner. As we sat at the kitchen table, he told me about a time in his 30s when he had lost his own job and spent nearly a year bouncing between temporary gigs. He said he used to sit in his car before interviews, gripping the steering wheel and doubting every decision he had ever made. I stared at him, stunned, because he had always seemed so steady, so unshakable. He shrugged and said something I'll never forget, You don't see the middle of someone's story when you're standing at the end of your own. That sentence settled into me like a seed. I realized I had been comparing my worst chapter to other people's highlight reels. I had been measuring my value against curated snapshots of success. And in doing so, I had ignored the messy, uncertain middle that everyone passes through. The anniversary of the night on the overpass came quietly. I drove past it on my way home from work, traffic moving steadily beneath the fading sky. I didn't stop this time. I didn't feel the urge to climb the railing or lean into the wind. Instead, I felt a strange gratitude for the version of me who had stepped back, who had chosen to go home even when he felt empty. That choice, small as it seemed, had given me the chance to rewrite what came next. I won't pretend everything is perfect now. There are still days when doubt creeps in, when rejection stings, when loneliness echoes louder than I'd like. But I no longer see those moments as proof of failure. I see them as part of the rhythm of being human. I've learned that strength isn't about never standing on the edge. It's about stepping back when you do. It's about answering the phone even when you're ashamed, about accepting soup from a neighbor when you'd rather hide, about updating your resume one more time even when you're tired of trying. The city still breathes. Traffic lights still blink red to green to yellow. Somewhere, a dog still barks at nothing in particular. But now, when I stand on that overpass in my memory, I don't see a man on the verge of disappearing. I see someone who is closer to beginning again than he realized. And that makes all the difference. A year after the night on the overpass, I thought I understood what it meant to rebuild a life, but I was wrong, because rebuilding isn't a straight line and it doesn't reward you just for surviving. It tests you again, differently, quietly, in places you thought were already healed. I didn't see it coming. That's the thing about growth. You assume once you've climbed out of the hole, the ground will stay solid beneath your feet. But sometimes the earth shifts, not to bury you, just to see if you've really learned how to stand. The new job had settled into routine. I wasn't the anxious newcomer anymore. I had my own projects, my own desk cluttered with sticky notes and half-empty coffee cups, my own rhythm. People started coming to me with questions. That felt good. Dangerous, but good. Because part of me still feared that if I looked too confident, life would notice and decide to humble me again. I worked hard, maybe too hard. I said yes to extra assignments. I stayed late even when no one asked me to. I told myself it was dedication, but if I'm honest, it was fear. Fear of becoming disposable again. Fear of hearing that polite corporate tone thanking me for my service. I was determined not to give anyone a reason to doubt my value. What I didn't realize was that I was the only one still doubting it. The first crack appeared in a meeting I had been preparing for weeks. It was a major presentation to senior leadership, the kind that could shape the direction of an entire department. I had rehearsed every slide, memorized every data point, anticipated every question. But when I stood in front of that long conference table, palms slightly damp, something unexpected happened. My voice didn't shake. My mind didn't blink. I spoke clearly, confidently. I handled questions without panic. And when it was over, there was a moment of silence that felt like a verdict. Then someone nodded. Then another. The director leaned back and said, "That was solid work." Just like that. No fireworks. No standing ovation. Just steady approval. And instead of relief, I felt something else. Grief. Because I realized how many years I had spent believing I wasn't capable of moments like that. Grief for the version of me who had stood on the overpass convinced he had nothing left to offer. That night I didn't celebrate. I drove to my dad's house instead. He was in the backyard trying to trim a tree he insisted was growing crooked. I helped him steady the ladder even though he still refused to admit he needed help. When we were done, we sat on the porch, sweat cooling on our skin. I told him about the presentation. He listened, nodding slowly, and then he said, "You're starting to believe it now, aren't you?" I didn't answer right away. Because believing in yourself isn't a switch you flip. It's a muscle you strengthen. And I was still testing mine. Around that time, I ran into Emma at a bookstore downtown. I hadn't seen her since the breakup. We both froze for half a second, the way people do when they're not sure whether to retreat or engage. She looked different. Or maybe I did. There was less tension in her posture, less defensiveness in mine. We exchanged the usual cautious greetings. "How have you been? You look good." Are you still living downtown? The conversation was polite, almost gentle. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to prove anything. I didn't feel the need to show her that I was doing better or to hide the fact that I had struggled. When she asked how work was going, I told her honestly. I told her about losing the old job, about the rough months, about starting over. She listened without interruption. Then she said something that caught me off guard. I wish you had let me see that side of you. I blinked. What side? She smiled softly. The real one. The one that doesn't pretend everything's fine. That sentence followed me home. I had spent so much of our relationship trying to be the stable one, the strong one, the guy who had it all together. I thought vulnerability would make me less attractive, less dependable. In reality, it had built a wall neither of us knew how to climb. We didn't get back together. That wasn't the point. The point was understanding. Growth isn't always about reclaiming what you lost. Sometimes it's about recognizing why you lost it and accepting that the lesson was the gift. Weeks turned into months. Work grew. Busier. My responsibilities expanded. I was offered a small team to manage, just 2 people at first. The idea terrified me. Leading myself had been hard enough. Now I was responsible for guiding others. On the first day, I sat across from them in a small meeting room and admitted something I would never have said a year earlier. I told them I didn't have all the answers. I told them I valued honesty over perfection. I told them mistakes were part of the process. As the words left my mouth, I realized I was speaking to my former self as much as to them. Leadership, I discovered, wasn't about appearing invincible. It was about creating space where others didn't have to pretend. And strangely, that made me stronger, not weaker. But life doesn't evolve in isolation. Just as things at work felt steady, my sister called again. This time, it wasn't about Dad's health. It was about hers. She had been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. Manageable, the doctors said. Not life-threatening, but chronic. Ongoing. The kind of thing that changes your daily reality. I drove to her apartment that night. She tried to downplay it, making jokes about finally having an excuse to cancel plans. But I could see the fear in her eyes. The same fear I had seen in my own reflection months ago. The fear of losing control. We sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, talking about treatment plans, insurance forms, lifestyle adjustments. I listened more than I spoke. And in listening, I realized how different I was from the man who once avoided phone calls out of shame. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding from discomfort. I was staying. Showing up. That became my quiet commitment. Not to be perfect. Not to fix everything. Just to stay present when things got hard. There were hospital visits. Flare-ups. Frustrated tears. Through it all, I learned that resilience isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like driving across town after a long day because someone you love needs company. It looks like sitting in waiting rooms without checking your phone every 5 seconds. It looks like admitting you're scared but choosing not to disappear. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I started therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I didn't want to wait until I was. The first session felt awkward. I stumbled over explanations, minimized my struggles, laughed at inappropriate moments. But my therapist had a way of gently pushing past the surface. She asked questions that made me pause. Questions about identity, about self-worth, about why achievement had become my measuring stick for value. Week by week, I began untangling beliefs I hadn't realized were shaping my life. The idea that love had to be earned. That failure was a verdict instead of feedback. That asking for help was weakness. We traced those narratives back through years of small moments, subtle reinforcements, cultural expectations. It wasn't about blaming anyone. It was about awareness. And awareness, I learned, is the beginning of choice. The overpass still existed in my memory, but it no longer defined the story. It became a reference point, not a destination. A reminder of what happens when silence grows unchecked. On the 2nd anniversary of that night, I did something I never would have imagined before. I organized a small gathering at my apartment. Nothing fancy. Just a few friends, my sister, even Mrs. Alvarez. We ordered takeout, crowded into the living room, laughed too loudly. At some point, someone asked how we all knew each other, and the conversation drifted to stories of bad jobs and breakups and health scares. And I realized something profound. Every person in that room had stood on their own version of an overpass at some point. Different circumstances. Same feeling of isolation. We just don't talk about it enough. Later, after everyone left and the apartment grew quiet, I stood by the window looking out at the city lights. The same city that had felt indifferent to my pain now looked different. Not kinder. Not softer. Just more human. Because I was seeing it through a different lens. I used to think survival was the goal. Just make it through. Don't fall. Don't fail too visibly. Now I understood that survival is the baseline, not the finish line. Living requires engagement, risk, vulnerability. It requires allowing people to see the cracks instead of constantly patching them over. I won't pretend I have everything figured out. I still have days where doubt whispers old arguments. Days when exhaustion makes me question whether the effort is worth it. But the difference now is that I don't face those days alone, and I don't treat them as proof that I'm broken. They're weather patterns. They pass. And when I think back to the man gripping the railing on that cold night, I don't feel shame. I feel compassion. He was doing the best he could with the tools he had. He stepped back. He went home. That was the first act of courage, even if he didn't recognize it as such. The second act was staying. The third was opening up. The fourth was choosing growth over pride. And the story isn't over. It never is. Because every morning you wake up, you're handed another blank page. Not to erase what came before, but to build on it. And this time, when I stand at the edge of anything uncertain, I don't see a drop waiting for me. I see a horizon. The third year after the night on the overpass didn't arrive with fireworks or tragedy. It arrived quietly, like most turning points do, disguised as an ordinary stretch of days. By then, the crisis had faded into memory. Therapy had become routine instead of rescue, and the new job no longer felt new. Stability had settled in. And strangely, stability scared me almost as much as chaos once had. When you've rebuilt yourself from the ground up, there's always a whisper in the back of your mind asking how long it will last. I had learned how to survive pain. Now I had to learn how to trust peace. That was harder than I expected. At work, my team had grown from 2 people to 6. I found myself in meetings where my opinion carried weight. I had to make decisions that affected more than just my own schedule. One afternoon, I was faced with cutting a project that someone on my team had poured months into. The numbers didn't justify continuing it. It wasn't personal. It was business. But I remembered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of decisions like that, to feel reduced to metrics. So instead of sending a short email, I sat down with him. I explained the reasoning transparently. I acknowledged the effort. I asked what he had learned from the process and how we could apply it elsewhere. He was disappointed, but he wasn't defeated. And walking back to my desk, I realized something. Leadership isn't about avoiding hard calls. It's about handling them with humanity. A few years ago, I wouldn't have had the emotional bandwidth for that. I was too busy protecting my own fragile sense of worth. Now, I could extend steadiness to someone else. That felt like progress you can't measure on a spreadsheet. Outside of work, my sister's condition had stabilized, though it required constant management. I had become the emergency contact on her medical forms. The first time I saw my name there, I felt the weight of it. Responsibility used to terrify me because I associated it with potential failure. Now I saw it differently. Responsibility meant trust. It meant presence. One evening, after a routine appointment, we stopped for coffee. She looked at me across the table and said, "You're different, you know." I asked how. She shrugged. "You used to disappear when things got hard. Now you lean in." I didn't know how to respond to that except with a quiet nod. She was right. I used to retreat into silence, convinced I was sparing others from my mess. In reality, I was isolating myself. Leaning in didn't mean I had all the answers. It meant I stayed even when I felt uncertain. That shift changed everything. Around that same time, I started dating again. Slowly. Intentionally. Not from a place of needing validation, but from a place of curiosity. I met Sarah at a mutual friend's game night. She was sharp, observant, and not easily impressed. Our first few conversations were light, playful. But eventually, the deeper topics surfaced. On our 4th date, she asked me about the hardest year of my life. I felt the old instinct to minimize it, to gloss over the messy parts. Instead, I told her the truth. Not every detail. Not the dramatic edge of the overpass image. But enough. I told her about losing the job. The spiral. Therapy. Rebuilding. She didn't look alarmed. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply listened and said, "Thank you for telling me." That simple response felt revolutionary. Vulnerability no longer felt like a liability. It felt like a filter. The right people leaned closer. The wrong ones drifted away. And that was okay. Sarah and I didn't rush. We built something steady. Not intense. Not chaotic. Steady. There were disagreements, of course. Moments where miscommunication flared up. But instead of shutting down, I practiced staying present. Saying what I felt without accusation. Listening without defensiveness. It wasn't perfect. It was intentional. And intention, I've learned, is more powerful than intensity. Meanwhile, Dad had started slowing down in ways he pretended not to notice. His cane was no longer optional. I began spending Sunday mornings at his house by default, not obligation. We fixed small things around the property, even when they didn't really need fixing. He told more stories about his younger years, some I'd heard before, others new. One morning, while we were clearing out the garage, he handed me an old toolbox. "You'll need this more than I will," he said casually. The words hit harder than he intended. It wasn't about the tools. It was about transition. Time moving forward whether we're ready or not. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how terrified I had once been of the future. Now, the fear felt different. Less about failing. More about losing. Losing time. Losing people. The anxiety wasn't centered on my own inadequacy anymore. It was centered on impermanence. Therapy helped me name that. Growth doesn't eliminate fear. It changes its shape. I started volunteering once a month at a local community center that offered job search workshops. The first time I stood in front of a small group of strangers and shared parts of my story, my heart raced. But as I spoke, I saw recognition in their faces. That quiet, exhausted recognition I used to see in my own reflection. I didn't present myself as a success story. I presented myself as proof that the middle of the story isn't the end. After one session, a man in his 40s lingered behind. He said he'd been laid off 6 months earlier and hadn't told most of his friends. He felt embarrassed. I told him I understood. Completely. And I meant it. Walking out to my car afterward, I realized something profound. The worst season of my life had become someone else's roadmap. Not because I handled it perfectly, but because I survived it honestly. That reframed everything. The overpass no longer symbolized despair. It symbolized a turning point I hadn't recognized at the time. Part of me still visits it occasionally, not physically, but mentally. Not to relive the darkness, but to measure the distance traveled. The man who stood there believed he was alone. He believed his value was tied to employment status and relationship titles. He believed asking for help was weakness. The man I am now knows better. Not because life became easier, but because I became more open. More willing to be seen in progress instead of only in polish. On the 3rd anniversary of that night, I did drive back there. This time, intentionally. I parked nearby and walked up as the sun was setting. The traffic still roared beneath. The wind still cut sharp against my face. But I stood a few steps back from the railing. I didn't need to grip it anymore. I let the air move around me and felt something close to gratitude. Not for the pain itself, but for the growth it forced. For the humility. For the clarity about what actually matters. A year ago, I had been learning to stand again. 2 years ago, I had been learning to stay. Now, I was learning to expand. To build not just recovery, but purpose. I thought about my team at work. My sister, Sarah. My dad. The community center. None of those connections would have deepened if I had continued hiding behind pride. None of them required me to be flawless. They required presence. As the sky shifted from orange to deep blue, I understood something that had taken years to internalize. Healing isn't a destination you arrive at and then retire from effort. It's a practice. A series of daily choices to engage instead of withdraw. To speak instead of suppress. To risk instead of retreat. I turned away from the railing and walked back to my car without ceremony. No dramatic declarations. No cinematic music swelling in the background. Just a quiet certainty that I was no longer afraid of my own story. The city lights flickered on one by one as I drove home. Somewhere, someone else was probably standing on their own version of an overpass, convinced they had reached the end. I wish I could tell them what I've learned. That the middle feels endless when you're in it. That silence amplifies shame. That asking for help is an act of courage. That rebuilding is slow, uneven, and absolutely possible. Mostly, I would tell them this. The fact that you're still here means the story isn't finished. And sometimes, the chapter you almost didn't survive becomes the one that teaches you how to truly live. In the months after I went back to the overpass, something subtle shifted again. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a deeper awareness that life doesn't pause once you've had your breakthrough moment. It keeps moving. Bills still show up. People still disappoint you. You still disappoint yourself sometimes. Growth doesn't exempt you from being human. It just changes how you respond to it. One afternoon at work, a proposal I had championed for weeks was rejected by upper management. Not revised. Not delayed. Rejected. The old version of me would have spiraled. I would have taken it personally, replayed every sentence I said in meetings, convinced myself I had overestimated my competence. I felt the familiar sting rising in my chest, that tightening sensation that whispers, "Here we go again." But instead of feeding it, I paused. I went for a walk around the block. I let the frustration exist without turning it into a verdict about who I was. When I came back inside, I asked for feedback. Clear. Specific. Actionable. It wasn't comfortable, but it was empowering. Failure stopped feeling like a mirror reflecting my worth and started feeling like information. That difference changed everything. Around the same time, Sarah and I had our first serious conflict. It wasn't about anything dramatic. It was about time. She felt I was overcommitting to work and volunteering. I felt she didn't understand how important those commitments were to me. The conversation escalated quickly. For a moment, I felt the urge to shut down, to withdraw into that protective silence I used to rely on. But I caught myself. I told her I needed 10 minutes to collect my thoughts, not to escape, but to avoid saying something defensive. When we sat back down, I spoke honestly about my fear of slipping backward, about how staying busy sometimes felt like insurance against becoming the man I used to be. She listened. Then she admitted she was afraid of being secondary to my recovery process, like she was competing with ghosts from my past. That hit me. Growth doesn't mean you stop having blind spots. It means you're willing to look at them. We didn't win the argument. We understood each other better. And that felt like progress. My sister had a rough flare-up that winter. A hospital stay that lasted longer than expected. I spent nights in the stiff chair beside her. Bed, the steady hum of machines filling the silence. There's something about hospital rooms that strips life down to essentials. No titles. No achievements. Just presence. At one point, she looked at me and said, "I'm scared." No jokes. No sarcasm. Just raw truth. I took her hand and said, "I know." I didn't try to fix it. I didn't offer hollow reassurance. I stayed. Years ago, I might have avoided moments like that because they forced me to confront how little control I actually have. Now, I understood that control is overrated. Connection is what steadies you. Dad eventually decided to sell the house. The house where we grew up. The kitchen table where homework happened. The backyard where he taught me how to ride a bike. Packing up those rooms felt like dismantling a timeline. We found old report cards, forgotten birthday cards, tools that hadn't been used in decades. At one point, I stood alone in my childhood bedroom, staring at the faint outline on the wall where posters once hung. I expected to feel sadness. And I did. But underneath it was gratitude. Not everyone gets the chance to look back at their beginnings with perspective. Moving doesn't erase what happened there. It just means the story continues somewhere else. On the final day before closing, Dad handed me a small box. Inside was a folded piece of paper. It was a note I had written in elementary school about what I wanted to be when I grew up. The handwriting was uneven, the spelling questionable, but the message was clear. I wanted to be someone who helps people and builds things. I laughed when I read it, then felt my throat tighten. In ways I hadn't consciously planned, that's exactly what I was doing. Helping my team grow. Helping my sister navigate her illness. building a life rooted in honesty instead of image. That realization didn't make me proud in an arrogant way. It made me grounded. The overpass, the job loss, the spiral, the therapy sessions, the uncomfortable conversations, the hospital nights, the leadership challenges, the arguments, the reconciliations. None of it was random. None of it was wasted. It was shaping me into someone that younger version would recognize. Not flawless, not fearless, but present, capable, real. I used to believe life would feel secure once I achieved the right milestones, the right salary, the right relationship, the right version of success. Now I understand security isn't about circumstances lining up perfectly. It's about knowing you can handle misalignment without collapsing. It's about trusting your ability to adapt, to ask for help, to begin again if necessary. There are still days when doubt shows up uninvited, when I question whether I'm doing enough, being enough. But those thoughts don't control me the way they once did. I see them for what they are. Echoes. Old survival scripts that no longer fit the life I'm building. And when I think about the man standing on that railing years ago, I don't see weakness. I see the beginning of awareness. The moment before a shift. He thought he was at the end of his capacity. In reality, he was at the start of his expansion. If I could stand beside him now, I wouldn't lecture him or rush him. I would simply tell him to hold on. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Just quietly. Hold on long enough to see that the pain is temporary, that identity isn't fixed, that worth isn't revoked by failure. Hold on long enough to discover that strength looks less like never falling and more like choosing to rise without pretending you were never down. Life is still unfolding. There will be new challenges, new losses, new beginnings. But I no longer fear the unfolding. Because I've lived through enough chapters to understand something essential. You are not defined by the moment you almost gave up. You are defined by what you build after you decide not to. And that decision, no matter how small it feels at the time, can echo through the rest of your life in ways you can't yet imagine.